Many. In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. We are happy to start again on the ladder of divine ascent. I don't, I'm sorry, I always have technological difficulty. Um, and I got to just make sure that we don't have a problem here. Okay. So, those of you on Zoom, those of you on YouTube, we are almost done with Lent, and we're almost done with this book, although I don't think we're going to finish it all, but we're going to take our time with step 15 today. Step 15 is about chastity or purity, and God willing, we'll get into another couple of smaller steps afterwards. But beginning with chastity, there's some sections that I definitely want to read with everyone. Do you have a copy of the book? The PDF, yeah. Do you have a copy of the PDF? Maybe you can share it with him. Just send it to him. So it's on the bottom of 171, talking about chastity, or I should say with the beginning, because we just spoken about gluttony and despondency, and many of these are connected. But he talks about purity. He says we have heard from that raving mistress gluttony, who has just spoken that her offspring is war against bodies. And no wonder, for our ancient ancestor Adam also teaches us this. And so basically, there's a connection between food and purity, a connection between eating and not just eating, but the joy of the palate, of the joy of the taste of food, and sexual desire. And so when we come here to this part, he's very clear about what it means to be chaste. To be chaste, in the next paragraph, is to put on the nature of an incorporeal being. Chastity is a supernatural denial of what one is by nature, so that a mortal and corruptible body is competing in a truly marvelous way with incorporeal spirits. Incorporeal, of course, obviously means without a body. A chaste man is someone who has driven out bodily love by means of divine love, who has used heavenly fire to quench the fires of the flesh. So, in one way, he's saying it's almost part of our uh, DNA, part of our nature to have this desire. But he's also saying you have to fight against it for the sake of your spirit, for the sake of your spiritual life, and that the soul is going to fight against the body, and the body is going to fight against the soul, and we're going to see who's going to be victorious in the end. But chastity is a name, he says, common to all virtues. A chaste man um, might be somebody who's not just, it's not just about sexuality, but it's about someone who's, kind of refraining himself or herself from going in a certain direction. So, for example, um, the beginning of chastity, he says on 172, is refusal to consent to evil thoughts and occasional dreamless emissions. The middle stage is to be free of dreams and emissions even when there are natural movements of the body brought on by eating too much. And the completion of chastity comes when mortified thoughts are followed by a mortified body. So obviously he's talking about emissions. That's a male thing. Um, to be honest, I don't know how this translates much with women, but the idea is that there are things that happen in the body, and there are desires that kind of manifest itself with the physical body, and so men have to first not have work against the natural, and then work against the natural that's kind of evoked by scenes or visions or things that might pop in their head. Um, and then afterwards, then there's this kind of mortification, almost like a dying, a deadening of the senses. In the next paragraph, he says, "The chaste man is a person whose members are in complete subjection to the soul. And I thought that's a nice definition for chastity. When your members are in complete subjection to your soul, and that might mean also in how you eat and how you spend your money and how you look at other people, obviously, all of that is connected. He goes a lot into like dreams and the idea of dreams. Here, you could take this. He goes a lot into dreams and again, this is very much related to the problems that happen to men. Maybe women realize this, maybe women don't, but young men and older can have basically these dreams that attack them in the middle of the night, which have no real clear origin and cause them to think that they're falling into sin, which is not just, it's not, it's something that you learn to fight against with prayer, and that's why a lot of times I tell youth and such, pray the Jesus prayer before you sleep, because when you're attacked with any thought, oftentimes the Jesus prayer jumps in and protects you. Is it a sin? Is it not a sin? It all depends on why, right? And why that dream came about, and that's something to be dealt with your spiritual father. Towards the end of 172, he says, the man who struggles against this enemy by sweat and bodily hardships is like someone who has tied his adversary with a reed. If he fights him with temperance, sleeplessness, and keeping watch, it is as if he had put fetters on him. If he fights with humility, calmness, and thirst, it is as if he had killed the enemy and buried him in sand, the sand being lowliness, since it does nothing to feed the passions and is only earth and ashes. What do we mean and what do we understand from that? Is that basically we fight for purity using different things, not satisfying the body completely, whether it be in sleep or in food or any type of luxury. Keeping watch means keeping vigil. Keeping vigil oftentimes means praying the Psalms. Humility, calmness, thirst, he says. All of that affects your desires. And so taking that all away calms the body down. So when somebody has um, sexual desires, sometimes it is coming from living too luxurious of a life, just enjoying everything, and then this is just side of one thing that kind of leads to another, leads to another. It also can be that there's just a natural period in the life of an individual, young boy, young girl, who they are being attacked, or they're just very much in that phase of that's all that they think about. That has to also be fought against. And then there's this kind of spontaneous stuff that happens from, it kind of comes out of nowhere, that are either diabolical attacks or things that you might have seen when you were younger, or did when you were younger, that kind of come to the forefront. All of this has to just, you just have to fight against it. Is this why is this such a priority? Like, why is this the priority? Why isn't, like, you know, people that fall into these sexual sins or have chastity as an issue, um, they they feel like this is like the main issue in their life, even though they could be angry people, judgy people, greedy people, lying, cheating, whatever. They feel like this is the one that we're going to get nailed for. This is the one that's really going to get me in trouble. This is the one that I really want to get rid of. Um, there is this desire for us to be chaste for the kingdom of God, to be chaste for Christ. It's built into us. Like as a kid, you might lie here, you might take something that's not yours when you're in a store, or you might do something kind of out of innocence. But when it comes to this transgression, you feel like, no, this wasn't just a careless mistake. This is something that's not right. Um, you are to never trust your body, to never let it relax. And this, by the way, even people who are married have to deal with this. Not in that they're tempted by another person, but there is a chaste way to engage in your relationship with your spouse, and an unchaste way, a more like a way that is, um, uh, I just say not chaste, just something to think about. Um, he goes on page 173, he says, I have seen men who lapsed against their will, and I've seen men who would willingly lapse but are unable to do so. The ones who would be willing to fall into sin if the opportunity arose. And he says, these I pity far more than the daily sinner, for though impotent, meaning they're powerless to actually fall into sin, they long for this corruption. And I've seen this, I've seen people, kind of confess to this, like I unfortunately, if I had the opportunity to fall into the sin, I would. Right? He says, this is the ones that have to be pitied more. A little bit later on, he says, do not imagine that you will overwhelm the demon of fornication by entering into an argument with him. Nature is on his side, and he has the best of the argument. So the man who decides to struggle against his flesh and to overcome it by his own efforts is fighting in vain. The truth is that unless the Lord overturns the house of the flesh and builds the house of the soul, the man wishing to overcome it has watched and fasted for nothing. Offer up to the Lord the weakness of your nature, admit your incapacity, and without your knowing it, you will win for yourself the gift of chastity. This is very interesting. He's basically saying you can't you can't fight and win. It's not going to be something that you're going to win on your own. But the demon of chastity, the demon of fornication, and the virtue of chastity will come to you through prayer and through the Lord giving you that victory. Um, and also the body, there comes a time where through fasting and prayer you're able to kind of curb it. You're able to overcome it. Um, but I do feel like this is, when we get away from our routines and we get away from the safety of our homes and we get away from that and we go, whether it's on vacation or we go on um, work trips or whatever, a lot of people unfortunately fall into bad habits or fall into sin in those environments. So it's important, when you're traveling, that you keep the routines of prayer, you keep the routines of fasting, and you keep the routines of going to church wherever you go. Um, in on page 173 towards 174, I mean, he is speaking to us in this day and age. He says, a victim of sensuality who had overcome his weakness told me once that within people is this kind in people of his kind, which is a victim of sensuality, there flourishes a yearning for bodies, a shameless and terrible spirit that asserts itself at the very heart's core. Sheer physical pain burns so fiercely in the heart that it is like being scorched by an open fire. The sufferer finds that because of this, he has no fear of God. He spurns the thought of punishment, turns away from prayer, and the sight of a corpse moves him no more than if it were a stone, basically a dead body. And why do I feel like he's speaking to us now? Because those are the basic um, desires of people that are addicted to pornography. Victims of victim of sensuality means what? You've been exposed to your innocence was taken away. You were exposed to something that ignited within you a sexuality. Like there's something in most individuals, if not all, that there comes a point in time where this is the point where their sexuality was ignited. Some people who are abused, it's ignited at a very young age, and they live a very difficult life overcoming that abuse. Other people later on might have been exposed to something um, by chance or you know by satanic temptation. And then what happens when people are in the moment, ignited by sexual desire, they have A, no fear of God. B, they don't think about what punishment is. C, they turn away from prayer. And D, they don't care about death, which is what he says here. He is like someone out of his mind in a daze, and he is perpetually drunk with desire for man or beast. And if a limit were not placed on the activities of this demon, no one would be saved. No one who is made of clay mingled with blood and foul moisture. How could they be saved? After all, everything created longs insatiably for its own kind, blood for blood, worm for worm, clay for clay. And what does flesh desire if not flesh? So you see, like he's sort of saying, flesh, it is the animalistic nature to desire another animal. And 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 what's interesting here, I think he says it little bit later. He says, men chase after women, but if women chased after men, no one would be saved. If women chased after men, no one would be saved. And he says this is kind of in the nature um, of men and women, unfortunately, but just something to keep in mind. Also, I wanted to another person who wrote on this. He says we should always look at every other human being as the icon of Christ, as an icon of Christ. And what happens in the sins where people are looking at people's physical nature and not their spiritual nature, it's and specifically with issues like porn, they says you turn off the image of Christ. You close your eyes to the image of Christ into that person. And you pretend like God is not there, or you are like it's like the demon tells you God is not there. Don't worry about it. Keep doing whatever sin you're about to do. On page 175, um, he puts together a question. He says, I ask you to consider who is greater, the man who dies and rises again, or the man who does not die at all? Basically, the man who sins and repents, or the man who never sins at all? He says, those who would pick the latter, man that does not die at all, are certainly wrong. For Christ himself died and rose. But he who opts for the former suggests in effect that one should not despair over the dying, or rather the lapsing. So yeah, people fall into sexual sins, but don't despair. Our relentless enemy, the teacher of fornication, whispers that God is lenient and particularly merciful to this passion, since it is so very natural. Yet, if we watch the wiles of the demons, we will observe that after we have actually sinned, they will affirm that God is just and inexorable judge. They say one thing to lead us into sin, another thing to overwhelm us in despair. And if we are sorrowful or inclined to despair, we are slower to sin again. But when the sorrow and the despair have been quenched, the tyrannical demon begins to speak to us again of God's mercy. And so we fall back into the cycle of falling into the sin. Um, on the next page, he speaks about chastity. He says, chastity makes us as familiar with God and as like him as any man could be. The mother of sweetness is earth and dew. The mother of chastity is stillness and obedience. So when we think about stillness and obedience, we've got to think about it in two ways. Sometimes we are active to leave our homes, to go do things, to get kind of um, you know, out and about, right? But that getting ourselves out and about can lead to an excitement both of our minds, of our hearts, and of this demon within us, or of this desire within us. But stillness is when we are kind of aware of our bodies, aware of what we're feeling, and we say, okay, let me guard myself from diabolical temptation. Let me remain where I am. Obedience is also the same thing, where it's like parents will tell you, or spiritual father will tell you, or whatever, someone will tell you and say, hey, watch out for this, don't go here. And we have to, on our own, um, learn to be obedient. Like, okay, I want to do this, but I should be obedient to my spiritual father, or I should be obedient not to fall into the sin. Stillness and obedience. So think about it next time you find yourself in a situation where chastity is being challenged. Say, okay, stillness. How could stillness help me here? How can obedience help me here? Um, and by the way, usually when somebody falls into the sin, um, uh, it's because there was about two or three, 4 or 5 stops where they could have avoided the sin, but at the very end, they fall into the sin because they didn't take the precautions. They didn't listen to, the words of the Holy Spirit telling them, don't go here, don't do this, don't be in this situation. Um, and we fall into these sins over and over again. On 177, he says, it often seems that those who incline them towards sensuality tend to be sympathetic, merciful, possessed of compunction, while those eager for chastity appear to lack these capacities in some measure. Very interesting observation. He says those who basically have difficulty with chastity tend to be sympathetic, merciful, and possessed of compunction. And there are many situations where people either lose their chastity or are basically, I guess you would say, in our language today, people that are highly sensitive. Sensitive people, maybe people that are trying to please others, maybe people that are trying to um, if it's not please others, they feel quickly depressed from what might be the situation. Um, and so what ends up happening is like, I don't want to say a self-medication, but sometimes people look to sensuality to feel better about their lives, to feel better about themselves. While those who lack this, like basically colder, austere, sort of more rigid, are able to embrace chastity easier. Um, why am I saying this? Is that you have to kind of understand yourself and understand your ability to understand your ability to fight against the sin and try to, if you feel like you're one of those people that has a difficulty with chastity, well, there are these good characteristics that you might have. Nevertheless, you have to fight harder against it. He says something interesting I have in my notes. Wow! Exclamation point. But he says in my 177, he says in that he says, leaving aside murder and the denial of God, what is the most serious of sins? I would reply, he says, I replied to lapse into heresy. And he says, in that case, why does the Catholic Church or the one church, the universal church, readmit heretics who have honestly come to reject their beliefs? Why are they deemed fit to share in the holy mysteries when, by contrast, a man who has committed fornication is excluded from these sacred mysteries for a number of years? Used to be the case that if someone fell into fornication, they would be told 7 years no communion, right? If someone and that's not counting adultery. I think adultery is even longer. It says from these sacred mysteries for a number of years, and this by the direct command of the apostolic canons, even though he may have not only confessed, but even abandoned his sinful ways. The question astonished me, and I still do not know the answer. Um, I think that heresy, ends up being a deviation of the mind, and this is kind of part of the notes here. But the sexual sins, engaging, oftentimes affect other people and are compounded, and they are looked at in a strict fashion for a number of reasons.
Uh,
I don't think we, first off, I don't think any priest today, um, uh, throws these types of canons out there, meaning throws these types of rules out there, but still it should be taken very seriously. Um, on the next page, any questions so far?
Hi.
He says in the middle of 178, he says, we have to be
What do you think of this?
Looks good.
comfortable when we are lying in bed.
Huh?
For that in
Real?
mind has to contend with demons outside of our body. It's interesting that we say that because also we have to be
Or was
careful
I going for fake?
on our phones while
Was I
watching
going for fake?
some obvious mistakes, but then also just the idea of like if I'm engaging in some
Like a
sort
real
of
life person?
battle or some sort of a uh, uh, you know,
God, I love you.
why would I hold in front of me something that um, could possibly tip me over the edge? And he says, so let the remembrance of death and the concise Jesus prayer go to sleep with you and get up with you. Nothing helps you as these do when you are asleep. And this is probably where I got this teaching from. Um, he talks a little bit about some things that affect men on the next page. When temptations come, our best weapons are sackcloth and ashes, all night vigils, standing up, hunger, the merest touch of water when we are thirsty, time passed among the burial places of the dead, and most important of all, humility of heart, and if possible, a spiritual director or helpful brother, old in wisdom rather than years, should also support us. Indeed, it would come as a great surprise if anyone could, by his own effort, save his ship from the sea. So, how do we modernize this language? When temptation comes, our best weapons are sackcloth and ashes. So, what would be kind of like the modern today sackcloth and ashes? Well, I think taking away some physical comfort doesn't mean we have to literally wear sackcloth and throw ashes, but take away some comfort. Um, allow yourself. The sackcloth and ashes also kind of takes a little bit of the beauty out of you. So you sort of just humble yourself and be humble in what you wear and how you look, and just sort of say, okay, I'm going to just act like I am repenting. Like think about sackcloth and ashes is usually what happens when, let's say, somebody dies or something really bad has happened. And unfortunately, some of us maybe have had this situation. Something bad happens, in those days you don't really care about what you eat, what you drink. You have to remind yourself to, unfortunately, to shower and take care of yourself. Shave if you shave. These types of things that's the sackcloth and ashes. When temptations come, let me humble myself and in that regard. All night vigils, standing up. Forget about all night vigils. Let's just pray our Egbeya. Pray the Psalms in those moments, in those times. Now, what if it happens in the middle of the night? Yeah, pray your Psalms in the middle of the night. Let that be something to affect you. Go to bed hungry. When you're thirsty, don't quench your thirst completely. Just have a little bit to drink. Time passed among the burial places of the dead is simply just remember that you will die, and where the dead are buried, that's where you will be buried. Humility of heart. Always recognize I can fall at any moment, in any time. God, create in me a clean heart. Create in me a clean heart. And then a spiritual brother or director, helpful, whatever. It could be just an accountability partner. Hey, I got to go out. I got to do something. I need somebody to talk to. I need somebody to be around, whatever. So I don't fall into sin, because a lot of the times these sins happen when I'm bored, alone, maybe even stressed out. But it's just sometimes we just need somebody to be around. Um, yeah, there's more here. Um, on the bottom of 181 to 182. He says, among the discerning fathers, distinctions, basically fathers who have talked about this, and says there are distinctions that are recognized between provocation, coupling, ascent, captivity, struggle, and the disease called passion. Um, and basically it's basically there are stages before things become a habit. Like we might be ignited by something, some idea, some idea or something that we see, and then we might be um, entertaining that idea in our mind for a little bit, and then we quickly assent and say okay, and then after we assent, we are captivated by it. Then we're struggling with it, and then it becomes a passion that is habitual, a passion that sometimes we long for, and a passion that is becomes, clings to us. And so we have to keep them, that's that whole idea of provocation can also be a curiosity. And we know that the saying of curiosity killed the cat. And that's essentially what happens when our chastity is taken away and this is something that's ignited within us. And what's amazing is that, again, even though he is writing to monks, I feel like he could be writing to people in our day, in our age. He talks about what are the levels of the demon that the demon of fornication does with us. First he says, first he darkens our minds, which guides us. And this demon urges and inclines us in the presence of other people to do things that only the mad would think of. Then, when our minds are cleared, we become ashamed of these unholy deeds, words, and gestures. I mean, this is something that happens too often. Um, but what rule or manner can I bind my body to? By what precedent can I judge him? Before I can bind him, he is let loose. Before I can condemn him, I am reconciled to him. Before I can punish him, I bow down to him and feel sorry for him. How can I hate him when my nature disposes me to love him? How can I break away from him when I am bound to him forever? How can I escape from him? How can I argue with him? This is all very much the struggle that people go through. If I try to bind him through fasting, then I have another sin, passing judgment on my neighbor. If I defeat him by not passing judgment, I become prideful. He is my helper and my enemy, my assistant and my opponent, a protector and a traitor. I am kind to him and he assaults me. If I wear him out, he gets weak. If he has arrest, he becomes unruly. If I upset him, he cannot stand it. If I mortify him, I endanger him. If I strike him down, I have nothing left by which to acquire virtues. I embrace him and I turn away from him. What is this mystery to me? And this is the final kind of stretch. He says, what is the principle of this mixture of body and soul? How can I be my own friend and my own enemy? Speak to me. Speak to me, my yoke fellow, my nature. I cannot ask anyone else but about you. How can I remain uninjured by you? How can I escape the danger of my own nature? I have made a promise to Christ that I will fight you. Yet how can I defeat your tyranny? But this I have resolved, namely, that I am going to master you. And this is what the flesh might say in reply. I will never tell you what you do not already know. I will speak the knowledge we both have. Within me is my begetter, the love of self. The fire that comes to me from outside is too much pampering and care. The fire within me is past ease and things long done. I conceived and give birth to sins, and they, when born, beget death by despair in their turn. And yet, if you have learned the sure and rooted weakness within both you and me, you will shackle me. If you starve your longings, you have bound my feet, and they can travel no further. If you take up the yoke of obedience, you have cast my yoke aside. If you have taken possession of humility, you have cut off my head. And that is the 15th step. So what were those three things that really bother him? Starving your longings. And that's something that everybody's got to figure out, what does that mean? Starving your longings. It could be something small, like I long for a certain type of food, a certain drink. I long to be with a certain person. I long to do a certain activity. Starving your longings means probably something similar to what I do with my kids. There's a point in time with my kids where I said yes to every sixth thing that they wanted. I want this, I want that, I want this, I want that. No, 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 no. Okay. No, whatever. I didn't count six, but it was like basically, and I told Marcia, I don't care what the six things are. I'm not going to say yes to anything. I'm just going to get them used to no, right? And then when I throw them a bone on that sixth time, then they'll be like, "Oh, Dad, that's great." So this is kind of the starving our longings. And I picture this beautifully in that book, The Way of the Ascetic by Tito Caliander, where he talks about how, I mean, this is pre-internet days, pre-whatever. He says, when you want to look at your watch, don't look at your watch. When you want to take a drink, get a drink. Don't get a drink. Wait another hour. When you want to take a nap, stand up and take a walk. When you want to take a walk and leave, sit in your seat and make sure you don't do what you want to do. And there was, honest, I think, some of the most successful times in my life spiritually were when I just said, I'm going to do the exact opposite thing of what I want to do. I don't want to pray. Okay, I'm going to pray. I want to sing loud. I'm not going to sing loud. I don't want to sing. I'm going to sing, right? This is like just in church. I want to sit down. I'm going to stay standing. All this stuff is just doing the exact opposite. And that's not even to mention, I'm going to tell this person what I think. Shut up. Don't say nothing, right? Just sit back. So that is that. I think in this chapter is worth reading in full and applying. Um, and of course, along with gluttony that we just read before, despondency, and some of these other longer chapters. The next chapter is short, avarice. I love how he describes it in the very beginning. Avarice, is greediness. Avarice, he says, is a worship of idols and is the offspring of unbelief. It makes excuses for infirmity and is the mouthpiece of old age. It is the prophet of hunger and the herald of drought. And basically, because the person who is avarice, the person who loves money, has a lack of faith in the fact that God gives us everything we need in due time. And he says in a little later, he says, "Do not say that you are interested in money for the sake of the poor, for two mites, um, for two mites were." That's not right. That's not the translation I heard. Two mites were sufficient to purchase the kingdom. For two mites were sufficient to purchase the kingdom, meaning the two mites of the woman. So you don't need a lot of money, and the poor don't need a lot of money. The poor, we all need the kingdom of God. A generous man met a miser, and the miser said the other man was without discernment. The man who is conquered by this vice has cut out care, but the man trapped by it can never pray freely to God. And he says the pretext of almsgiving is the start of avarice, but it finishes by not caring for the poor. The rich person basically says, I want to be rich so I can give to the poor. And by the time that person becomes rich, they don't care about the poor anymore. This is, and this is also said by St. Paul, the love of money is the root of all evil. The love of money is the root of all evil. So in these steps, this one has to be cut out pretty quickly. But poverty, which in our sense, this is step 17, poverty is something that we can all take on a little bit to some extent. Um, it's this idea of everything is God's, and I offer up everything to God, and I'm going to live as if, this is a gift from God to me, but I don't deserve it. It's not something I've earned. And I'm giving it up for the sake of the kingdom. So there are people that there's a period of time, in your lives, and I think more among those who are younger than older. So you figure out whether you're young or old. But there's this period of time where you can give and give freely, not worrying. You can give because you don't have a lot of responsibilities or liabilities. You can give a person, um, you know, and say, God, take care of me for the rest of the day. And I've seen people do this. They say, Abuna, I gave away all my money. The first person I saw, poor person I saw in the morning, and I said to God, take care of me for the rest of the day. And God sent me food. God, everything I needed was taken care of that day. And Saint Basil says to us, you know, was it Saint Basil? Yeah, or Saint John Chrysostom. Um, says when you give to God, you're lending to the poor. When you give to the poor, you're lending to God, and God will repay. And that's something about poverty. Poverty is like not literally poor, although some of us might find ourselves literally poor, but it's not about literally being poor, but it's about freeing your mind from what you have as if it was your own, but it's actually in God's service. Um, Questions about this one? All right. This one, just going to read one or two lines, one or two lines from it. Um, he says, "The man who has tasted the things of heaven easily thinks nothing of what is below, but he who has had no taste of heaven finds pleasure in possessions." And then he says, "A man who is poor for no good reason falls into a double misfortune. He goes without the present goods and is deprived of these in the future." So basically, if you're poor for no reason, you're missing out on goods here and goods there. But he says, we monks should be careful not to be less trusting than the birds, nor are which are not anxious and do not gather into barns. The man who gives up possessions for religious motives is great, but the man who renounces his will is holy indeed. The one will earn money or grace 100 times over, but the other will inherit eternal life. And for us, I think that it's not so much about what we possess, but are we lovers of what we possess? Are we, in the situation where uh, someone has um, his or her car is being taken, and they have the ability to use deadly force to stop the taking, and they debate whether is this right? And of course, usually the law. I don't know what the law in California. I'm sure it's the same, but you can't protect property with deadly force. You can protect yourself, you can protect your home and yourself, but you can't protect property with deadly force. Um, but the idea is that even if we have that idea, then we're kind of possessed by our possessions. But if someone takes something and say, okay, fellas, at least I have my life, and if I can get it back, I'll get it back, but I put it in God's hands. Ask God to guide me, ask God to help me. But I mean, when I lived in New York City, I never had one penny taken away from me. And I lived in the city. My room was always unlocked. Granted, it's a dorm room, but I was like, whatever. I don't have anything. I always joke, and it's still to this day, the only person that could steal anything from me would have to be a graduate theological student, because that's the only thing of value in my house are these books. But other than that, there's really nothing of value. We would be very happy if someone took Zeus, our dog. But regardless of that, the idea is that I shouldn't be possessed by what I own. And if I am possessed, I should be able to give it up immediately. And to the extent that if someone asks me for my favorite pair of, shoes or my favorite galabeya, right? My galabeya is my cassock. I said, give it, yeah, sure, take it, right? And I always made that, a priority, and actually the thing is, um, if there's anything, from a young age, even with books, if someone asks me for something, I give it to them because I can't be possessed by any of this stuff. And this is, I think, where the idea of poverty sets in. Everything that's been given to me has been given to me as a gift from God, and I am a steward of it, not a possessor of it. He also says, I have said, so he says, avarice is said to be the root of all evil, and it is so because it causes hatred, it causes theft, it causes envy, separations, hostility, stormy blasts, remembrance of past wrongs, inhumane acts, and even murder. And tons of stories have been written about this. But a small fire can burn down an entire forest. But one virtue can help many to escape all the vices mentioned above. That virtue is detachment, which is a withdrawal from all evil desires, and which grows from an experience and a taste of the knowledge of God, and from a meditation on the account to be rendered after death. This is a good step, and I think this is a good place to stop. I would like to do a lot of these small steps going forward. Um, Step 22 is going to be an important one, and step 23. So maybe we can get up to step 22 and step 23 by next week. Step 25 is humility. How about we do this? Can we do step 22? Oh, discernment's also good. No, we're not going to get through it all because next week's last week. So let's just keep going. We'll keep reading, and we'll figure out who's going to help me next week because I really need help. I thought, Michael, were you supposed to do today? Were you supposed to do today? All right, we'll find somebody. All right. Any questions or comments? All right. Okay, go in peace, the peace of